She waited for him all night in a hotel room that overlooked the cold lights of the city, believing that silence meant respect, and delay meant nothing more than business. But what she didn't know was that in another part of the world, the man she was waiting for was standing in front of a mirror, adjusting a ring he never mentioned, preparing to marry another woman without a single warning. This is not just a story about betrayal. It's a story about power hidden behind silence, about a man who controls entire industries but loses control of the one thing he never thought mattered: time. Because in his world, people don't get left behind by accident. They get left behind by decision. And the woman who waited that night was not just forgotten. She was replaced while still breathing hope in the same hour. What happens when loyalty meets silence, and silence turns into a final goodbye? This channel tells stories about mafia bosses, men born to dominate. Lessons the real world never teaches you come only from those who control it. This is not about crime. This is about mindset, strength, and the hidden psychology of power behind every decision that changes a life. The lesson of this story is simple. Never confuse waiting with being chosen. Because in the world of power, silence is often the loudest rejection. If this story pulled you in, like, comment, and subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes waiting is love.
Rafael Moreira had spent most of his adult life inside rooms where men lied for money and smiled while doing it. He had negotiated million-dollar shipping contracts over handmade pasta in Naples, threatened a Russian broker in the back of a nightclub outside Marseille, and once convinced three armed men in Phoenix not to kill him by calmly ordering another round of whiskey before anyone pulled a trigger. By 45, there were very few environments left that unsettled him. Fear, he had learned years ago, was usually just unfamiliarity wearing expensive clothes. But somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, 30,000 feet above black water and invisible storms, Raphael sat alone beneath the dim yellow glow of a reading lamp and experienced something dangerously close to uncertainty. The private jet was silent, except for the low mechanical hum beneath the floorboards. Most of his crew slept farther toward the front cabin. His assistant had dozed off, with a tablet still glowing faintly on his chest. The rest of the aircraft existed in that strange overnight stillness where time no longer felt connected to the world below. Raphael sat at the long walnut table near the back of the plane, jacket folded beside him, white dress shirt sleeves rolled once at the wrists. A crystal glass of untouched bourbon rested near his right hand, while documents lay spread neatly before him in organized stacks. Shipping manifests, port schedules, contract drafts, financial summaries, the language of international business, the language of power. He flipped through another page without effort. He never highlighted documents, never wrote notes. People who worked for him had learned long ago that Raphael remembered everything after reading it once. Dates, numbers, faces, weaknesses. He carried information the way other men carried weapons. Outside the window, there was nothing but darkness. Raphael leaned back slowly and rubbed a hand across his jaw. The silver beginning to creep into his beard made him look distinguished to strangers and dangerous to everyone else. At his age, most powerful men either softened or became monsters. Raphael had somehow become both. He reached for the bourbon, considered it, then set it back down untouched. "Get Marco," he said quietly without looking up. Near the front of the cabin, his assistant stirred awake immediately. "Sir?" "Marco," Raphael repeated. "I want him to review the Barrett notes before we land." The silence that followed was subtle, small enough that most people would to notice. Raphael noticed everything. His eyes lifted slowly. The assistant swallowed once before speaking. "Marco is coming, sir." The air inside the cabin seemed to tighten. Raphael stared at him without expression. "What do you mean he is coming?" He called 4 hours before departure. Family emergency. The assistant sat up straighter now, nervousness creeping into his voice. Gabriel arranged a replacement interpreter already. Credentials checked out. Raphael said nothing. That was always worse than yelling. He's worked for me 8 years, Raphael finally said, and he disappears 4 hours before an overseas negotiation? Yes, sir. And nobody thought to wake me? We tried to resolve it before takeoff. Raphael leaned back again, eyes returning to the documents in front of him, though he was no longer reading them. What S the replacement S name? Vivian Marlowe. Background? Freelance interpreter. Corporate negotiations embassies. European trade conferences. Speaks Italian, French, English. That made Raphael pause. Italian? Yes, sir. Interesting. He looked back out the dark window. Below them stretched thousands of miles of empty ocean. No cities, no lights, no witnesses. For the first time in years, Raphael became aware of something he hated feeling: dependence. A negotiation overseas meant language matter than guns, money, or reputation. In New York, Raphael controlled rooms because everybody understood exactly who he was the second he walked inside. Fear translated universally there. Abroad, things became softer, more dangerous. A mistranslated sentence could cost millions or start wars. Raphael closed the final folder and stood slowly from the table. He moved toward the rear of the cabin where the lights stayed low and private. From a compartment beside the leather seating area, he removed his phone and pressed an old voicemail saved years earlier. Static crackled softly. Then an older man's voice spoke in tired Italian. Raphael's father. For a moment, the plane disappeared. The ocean disappeared. Time itself disappeared. The voice spoke warmly about groceries, about weather, about Sunday dinner. Nothing important. That was what made it unbearable. Raphael listened quietly until the recording reached the middle. Then he shut it off before the end. He always shut it off before the end, because the final part of the voicemail had been recorded 3 days before his father died in a Newark hospital while trying unsuccessfully to explain to nurses in broken English and desperate Italian that he was asking for medication. He was asking for water. Nobody understood him. Raphael had been 12 years old. Some people carried grief in photographs. Raphael carried it in language. Hours later, Sol appeared beneath the aircraft like a living constellation, endless lights glowing through the darkness, sharp lines of highways, glass towers rising like silver knives from the earth. The city looked awake even at dawn. By the time Raphael stepped into the lobby of the Schilla Hotel, exhaustion had settled deep behind his eyes, though nobody around him would have noticed. Men like Raphael learned early that fatigue was a vulnerability best hidden. The lobby smelled faintly of polished marble, expensive flowers, and coffee. That was when he saw her. Vivian Marlowe stood near one of the tall windows overlooking the city gardens below. One hand held a slim leather portfolio. The other carried a paper coffee cup, dark charcoal coat, black slacks, hair pinned back simply. No unnecessary jewelry, no attempt to impress anyone. But she wasn't nervous. That was the first thing Raphael noticed. Most people meeting him for the first time either overperformed confidence or failed to hide intimidation. Vivian did neither. She simply watched. And somehow, within seconds, Raphael understood she had already identified him before anyone introduced them. Not because she recognized his face, but because she understood power dynamics. The two men behind him moved subtly around his pace instead of their own. Staff members glanced toward him instinctively. Rooms shifted slightly when he entered them. People like Vivian noticed those things professionally. She stepped forward once he approached. Mr. Moretti. Not a question. Her voice was calm, low, controlled. Vivian Marlowe. Also, not a question. For 3 long seconds, neither moved. Neither smiled. Two professionals evaluating risk. Finally, she handed him a thin folder. I reviewed the Barrett briefing during the drive from the airport. And? I have questions about how you negotiate. One eyebrow lifted slightly. Most employees tried to sound useful around powerful men. Vivian sounded efficient. You'll have 30 minutes in the car, Raphael said. I'll need 45. A smaller man would have interpreted that as attitude. Raphael heard competence instead. He studied her another second before nodding once. Fine. The elevator ride upstairs passed mostly in silence. Gabriel updated Raphael quietly about the afternoon schedule, while Vivian stood beside them facing forward, coffee cup still in hand. At one point, Raphael replied in Italian without thinking. A short sentence. Personal. Nothing important. Vivian didn't react, not even slightly. Interesting. When the elevator doors opened, Raphael stepped into the suite first. He loosened his cufflinks while one of the bodyguards rolled luggage inside behind him. His eyes drifted briefly toward the smaller black suitcase near the door. Something about it looked slightly wrong, not visibly wrong, just touched, moved. The sensation was so small another man might ignored it. Raphael didn't ignore instincts. He looked at the suitcase 1 second longer than necessary before turning away. Behind him, Gabriel's phone buzzed once inside his coat pocket. Gabriel checked the screen quickly, too quickly, then silenced it. Vivian noticed. Raphael didn't, not yet. And somewhere inside the city beyond the hotel windows, invisible forces had already begun moving toward all of them. The dangerous thing about misunderstandings was how ordinary they looked in the beginning. Sometimes the moment that ruins your life arrives quietly, without music, without outwarning, without anyone in the room understanding what S actually started. Morning traffic in Seoul moved with the smooth precision of something rehearsed thousands of times before dawn. Black sedans slid between buses and motorcycles beneath endless rows of glowing signs while the city slowly woke around them. Office towers reflected pale silver light against low clouds hanging above the Han River, and somewhere below the polished glass skyline, restaurants were already boiling broth for the lunch crowds that would come hours later. Inside the back seat of the Mercedes, Raphael Merchisity sat angled slightly toward the window, one arm resting against the door, expression unreadable behind dark sunglasses. Across from him, Vivian Marlowe had transformed the back seat into a mobile briefing room within minutes of departure. A tablet rested open on her lap beside handwritten notes in a slim black notebook. 3 folders sat organized by color beside her knee. Her coffee was gone already. She worked like someone who respected time enough not to waste movement. Before we get into negotiation structure, she said calmly, I need clarification on how you use silence. Raphael glanced toward her slowly. Silence. Yes, that's your first question? It's the most important one. Gabriel, seated in the passenger seat up front, shifted slightly as if unsure whether this conversation was normal. Raphael didn't answer immediately. Vivian continued before he could dismiss the point. In American business culture, silence usually creates discomfort. In Korean negotiations, silence often creates pressure. Those are not the same thing. If you pause after an offer, Park Barrett may interpret it as strategic dissatisfaction rather than consideration. She flipped a page. So I need to know whether your pauses are intentional. Raphael stared at her for another moment. You always interrogate clients this aggressively? I interrogate communication problems before they happen. The corner of Raphael's mouth almost moved. Almost. Interesting woman. Outside the window, Seoul rushed by in streams of gray buildings and wet pavement from earlier rain. Raphael watched pedestrians crossing intersections with umbrellas folded under their arms. Everything felt ordered, fast, controlled, but not by him. That remained the uncomfortable part. You asked about silence, he said finally. Most people talk too much when they are nervous. I prefer to let them. Vivian nodded once as if confirming a theory. So the pauses are deliberate, usually. And when they aren't tea, that made him look at her directly. Her expression remained completely professional, but there was something underneath it Raphael couldn't place yet. Not curiosity, exactly. Observation. Like she was listening to the structure underneath his sentences instead of the words themselves. When they aren't, Raphael said slowly, it means I am deciding whether the person across from me deserves honesty. Vivian wrote something down in shorthand. Raphael Wattpen moved quickly across the page. What did you write? Nothing important. That S never true when someone says it. She looked up from the notebook calmly. I wrote that you distinguish between truth and honesty. Most people think they read the same thing. Gabriel glanced backward briefly. Raphael leaned back against the leather seat. And what's the difference? Truth is information. Honesty is intention. That answer sat in the air between them longer than expected. Vivian turned another page in the briefing. The word you want to avoid today is urgent. Raphael blinked once. Why in Korean corporate culture, urgency implies weakness unless there's already trust established? If you say the timeline is urgent, Park Barrett hears that you need the deal more than he does. And if I do need it, then, especially don't to say urgent. That earned the smallest exhale from Raphael that might have qualified as amusement. Vivian continued. Use timely instead. Same objective. Different emotional temperature.
You do this with every client?
I make sure they reheard correctly. She paused briefly. That S different from simply being translated. Raphael studied her again. Most interpreters he worked with treated language mechanically. Convert sentence. Maintain tone. Move on. Vivian approached it like psychological architecture. You think translation changes power dynamics, he said. It absolutely changes power dynamics. How? Because whoever controls interpretation controls emotional framing. Raphael removed his sunglasses slowly. Now she had his full attention. Vivian did seem impressed by that fact. Let us say you insult someone directly, she continued. A bad interpreter translates the insult exactly. A good interpreter softens it enough to preserve the negotiation while keeping the intention intact. And which kind are you? The kind that keeps rooms from collapsing unnecessarily. Interesting answer, sir, again. The car slowed beneath the sweeping entrance of Barrett International Holdings 30 minutes later. The building rose 40 stories above Gangnam, like polished steel pulled straight from the ground. Sharp lines, reflective glass, expensive understatement. Power disguised as professionalism. Raphael stepped from the vehicle first. The cold morning air smelled faintly like rain and engine exhaust. Vivian exited beside him, adjusting her coat once while reviewing the final notes on her tablet. You've met Park Barrett before? Raphael asked quietly as they approached the entrance. Twice. And he respects composure more than confidence. That sounds contradictory. It is tea here. Raphael nodded once. Inside, the lobby gleamed with dark marble and muted lighting. Employees moved quickly but quietly across the polished floors, while assistants carried tablets and coffee cups between elevators. Nobody stared openly at Raphael, but people noticed him. Men like Raphael carried gravity into rooms whether they wanted to or not. At the elevator, Vivian stepped slightly closer without lowering her voice. One more thing. What? Park Barrett was educated in Tokyo before returning to Korea. His formal communication style shifts depending on whether he feels respected or challenged. You saying I should be polite? I'm saying if you dominate too early, he'll stop negotiating and start performing authority instead. And if I let him, then he'll underestimate you. Raphael looked at her. So what exactly do you recommend? Vivian met his eyes calmly. Let him think he understands you for the first 10 minutes. The elevator doors opened, 40th floor. The conference room overlooked nearly the entire city. Glass walls framed Seoul in silver and gray, while an impossibly long black conference table sat beneath modern hanging lights. Tea had already been prepared neatly at each seat. Park Barrett stood waiting near the windows with 3 executives beside him. Late 60s, immaculate suit. Silver hair, combed carefully back. The kind of man who projected patience because he'd spent decades learning how profitable patience could become. Beside him stood a younger man in his late 20s, with sharp features and nervous eyes, his interpreter, Thomas Barrett, nephew, according to the briefing. Introductions happened smoothly. Hands shook, cards exchanged, everyone sat, and immediately Raphael understood something important. This room contained 2 negotiations happening simultaneously, one visible, one hidden beneath language itself. The official conversation began with logistics, shipping routes, customs partnerships, timelines for luxury imports, moving through Mediterranean ports into East Asian markets. But beneath every translated sentence existed another conversation entirely. Status. Control, intelligence, gathering. Vivian translated with frightening precision, not word for word, meaning for meaning. Raphael noticed it almost immediately. When he spoke directly, she adjusted cadence slightly before delivering the Korean version, softer in some moments, sharper in others, occasionally adding formal structures that made his statements sound less transactional and more strategic. At first, Raphael disliked it instinctively. Then he watched the reactions around the table. Executives who initially seemed skeptical began listening more carefully after Vivian translated. Park Barrett leaned forward incrementally. Respect levels shifted. Vivian noticed everything. Halfway through the meeting, Park turned slightly toward Thomas and muttered something quietly in Korean, not intended for Raphael. Vivian heard it anyway. Her eyes shifted toward Raphael fell for less than half a second. Then she translated softly without interrupting the meeting flow. He says you look younger than he expected, and he's unsure whether you have final authority. Raphael didn't react outwardly, but something inside him sharpened immediately. That information mattered. Without missing rhythm, Raphael folded his hands together calmly and responded in English. Mr. Barrett, I understand caution, especially in long-term partnerships. But I don't attend meetings where someone else makes decisions for me. Vivian translated, but Raphael noticed something subtle. The Korean version carried slightly more weight than the English one had. Not aggressive, certain. Park Barrett's expression changed almost invisibly afterward. Interesting. Very interesting. The rest of the meeting moved differently after that. Less testing. More engagement. By the time contracts were discussed seriously, Raphael realized Vivian had effectively recalibrated the room in his favor without making it obvious to anyone except him. That made her valuable. Dangerously valuable. When the meeting finally ended nearly 2 hours later, Raphael stood beside Vivian inside the descending elevator, while Gabriel reviewed updated notes quietly beside them. Neither spoke for several floors. Then Raphael finally said, "You changed something." Vivian looked ahead at the closing elevator doors. "You adjusted my wording. I adjusted your intention. That's not the same thing." "No," she agreed calmly. "It's usually more important." Raphael studied her profile carefully, and if I want interpretation, then hire software. Gabriel nearly looked back again, but stopped himself. Vivian continued evenly. Machines translate vocabulary. Human beings translate meaning. The elevator reached the lobby, doors opened. But Raphael didn't move immediately. "You assume a lot for someone who met me this morning." "No," Vivian replied. "I listen a lot." Different skill. Then she stepped out into the lobby without waiting for him. For a moment, Raphael remained standing inside the elevator, watching her walk ahead through the marble lobby. Nobody ignored her, exactly. But nobody truly noticed her either. That fascinated him. Because Vivian Marlowe possessed the rare ability to alter the temperature of powerful rooms while appearing almost invisible inside them. That kind of skill changed outcomes, and outcomes were the only language Raphael trusted completely. Lunch happened at a quiet restaurant several blocks away from the business district. Vivian selected it without discussion after rejecting 2 recommendations from hotel staff. Raphael allowed it mostly because he wanted to observe how she moved through spaces she understood naturally. The restaurant was small, warm lighting, wooden tables, steam rising from the kitchen, behind half curtains. Nobody recognized Raphael here. Nobody cared who he was, for reasons he couldn't entirely explain. That irritated him slightly. Vivian ordered fluently in Korean without checking the menu. "What did you get?" Raphael asked once the server left. "You'll survive." That S, not an answer. It S, beef soup and side dishes. "You trust this place?" "Yes, you trust easily." "No," she said calmly. "I returned to consistency." Again with answers that sounded simple until you thought about them too long. The food arrived quickly. Raphael watched her while they ate. Not in a romantic way, not yet, professionally. How she handled silence, how she organized information mentally, how quickly she shifted between cultural registers, depending on who approached the table. At one point, the elderly owner stopped beside them and asked Vivian something warmly in Korean. Vivian answered briefly. The woman laughed. Vivian laughed too, softly, naturally. And suddenly Raphael experienced an unexpectedly strange realization. There existed an entire version of Vivian Marlowe inaccessible to him. Not hidden, simply unreachable through language. He watched her for another second after the restaurant owner walked away. "What was that about?" She asked if you liked the soup. "And?" I said yes. That made her laugh? Vivian sipped tea calmly. "I also told her you looked emotionally offended by how good it was." Raphael stared at her flatly. "I did not. You absolutely did. That's ridiculous. You remaking the face again right now." Against his will, Raphael felt something dangerously unfamiliar pressing briefly against the edges of his composure. Amusement, real amusement. It disappeared quickly, but Vivian noticed it. Of course she did. By late evening, Seoul had become rain and neon outside the hotel windows. Raphael stood alone inside the white his suite, loosening his tie slowly, while the city reflected across the glass. The meeting had gone better than expected. Too well, maybe. That usually meant hidden problems remained somewhere underneath the surface. His instincts refused to settle completely. He moved toward the luggage near the bedroom entrance, almost absent-mindedly. Then stopped. Something was wrong. Not obvious, not dramatic, but wrong. Raphael crouched beside the black suitcase slowly. The zipper alignment looked slightly uneven. The inner lining didn't sit perfectly flat anymore. A sensation colder than concern slid quietly through his chest. He opened the suitcase carefully. Shirts, documents, toiletries, everything appeared normal. But Raphael had spent 20 years surviving because he trusted instincts other men ignored. And right now, every instinct he possessed was telling him one thing clearly. Someone had touched his luggage. Someone careful. Someone professional. And suddenly, for the first time since landing in Seoul, Raphael understood something dangerous might already be moving beneath the negotiation. Everyone else still believed was only business. By the third morning in Seoul, Raphael Moretti had stopped pretending the city felt temporary. Some places stayed external, no matter how long you stood inside them. Seoul didn't. It moved too quickly for that. The streets pulsed before sunrise. Coffee shops filled with exhausted students and overworked executives before 6 in the morning, and every glass tower reflected another version of the city back onto itself until a man could almost forget where one district ended and another began. Raphael stood near the hotel window with espresso in one hand, watching rain collect in silver streaks against the glass 30 floors above the street. He had slept less than 4 hours. Normally, that made him sharper. Today, it only made him thoughtful. Behind him, someone knocked once against the suite door. Not Gabriel. Too light. Come in, Raphael said. Vivian stepped inside, carrying her notebook and 2 folders tucked beneath her arm. She wore a charcoal coat over a black turtleneck today. Her dark hair pinned loosely back instead of perfectly arranged like the first morning. More relaxed, or maybe simply tired enough not to care. Morning, she said. Raphael glanced at the clock. It's 6:30. Yes, that S not morning. That S punishment. For the first time since meeting him, Vivian laughed softly without trying to hide it. You re-adapting to Seoul already. I'm adapting badly. That S still adaptation. She crossed the swimsuit calmly and placed the folders on the dining table before removing her coat. Raphael noticed she moved through rooms quietly even when nobody else was present, like someone who had spent years entering environments where drawing attention carried consequences. You eat? She asked. Espresso counts, she said flatly. It does tea. Before Raphael could answer, she reached into the paper bag Shin carried in with her and placed 2 wrapped breakfast sandwiches onto the table beside him. Raphael looked at them suspiciously. What is this? Food. I can see that. You need actual calories before today's meeting. You always this controlling with clients? Vivian sat down across from him and opened her notebook. Only the stubborn ones. Raphael stared at the sandwich another second before finally unwrapping it. Egg. Beef. Some kind of spicy sauce he couldn't identify. He took one bite, paused. Vivian didn't look up from her notes. That face is again. Raphael narrowed his eyes. What face? The face where you've already decided you like something but refuse to emotionally commit yet. That's not a real observation. It absolutely is. Against his better judgment, Raphael finished nearly half the sandwich while reviewing contracts. Outside, rain intensified over the city. Inside, something quieter had begun shifting between them during the last 48 hours. Not romance. Not trust exactly either. Something more dangerous. Familiarity. The kind that arrived through repeated proximity and observation rather than intention. Vivian flipped another page in her notebook. Before we leave, she said, I want to teach you one word. Raphael looked up. One word. In Korean. I thought we agreed my pronunciation was a public safety issue. It still is, she admitted, but this one matters. She wrote carefully across the top of a blank page before turning the notebook toward him. Ginchanayo. Raphael stared at the characters. That means none to me. It's pronounced Guanchanayo. He repeated it badly. Vivian winced immediately. That sounded like you threatened someone. I'm Italian. Everything sounds threatening. Again. He tried again. Closer this time. She corrected him twice more, before finally nodding slightly. Better. What exactly did I just say? It means several things. She leaned back thoughtfully, literally. It's okay, but not exactly. That S helpful. In Korean, the phrase carries emotional context. Depending on tone, it can mean I'm okay, or don't worry, or we all right here. Raphael repeated the word quietly under his breath once more. Why this one? Vivian closed the notebook slowly, because awkward moments matter here. Small discomforts matter. If something goes wrong during a meeting and you use this naturally, people relax around you. Raphael leaned back slightly. One word does all that? In the right moment, yes. Interesting. Vivian studied him another second before continuing. It says also a very human phrase. What says that supposed to mean? Most business language sounds transactional. This does tea. Raphael turned his coffee cup slowly between his fingers. My father died in a hospital in Newark, he said suddenly. The words arrived so unexpectedly, even he seemed mild surprised hearing them aloud. Vivian remained completely still. He spoke almost no English. Raphael continued quietly. The nurses misunderstood him for hours. His eyes stayed fixed on the dark espresso. He kept asking for water. They thought he was asking for medication. The rain pressed harder against the windows. Vivian said nothing. No automatic sympathy. No performance. Just attention. And somehow that felt more respectful than pity would have. Raphael exhaled once through his nose. I was 12, he said. Vivian nodded slowly. That's why, she said softly. That's why this word. Something tightened unexpectedly in Raphael's chest. Not exactly recognition. Because somehow this woman, he'd known less than a week, had identified the emotional center of a story he'd spent decades refusing to explain. And she'd done it, without forcing him to say it directly. That unsettled him more than threats ever could. His eyes drifted toward the notebook in front of her. What is that thing, anyway? Vivian glanced down. My shorthand. You write during meetings constantly. I write during conversations constantly. What kind of shorthand? The useful kind. Raphael extended his hand slightly. Let me see. Vivian hesitated. That alone interested him. Then finally she turned the notebook around. The page looked almost impossible to decipher. English fragments mixed with symbols, arrows, Korean characters, Italian abbreviations, and what appeared to be entirely invented markings layered together across the paper. Raphael frowned. What am I looking at? A map. Of what? How people speak. That answer should not have made sense. Unfortunately, it did. Raphael pointed toward one section. What does that mean? Vivian glanced at it. That you pause before saying the most important thing. Raphael went still. And that, she added casually. You look at your left hand whenever you deciding whether to trust someone. Instinctively, Raphael glanced downward. His left hand rested flat against the table. Vivian watched him notice, then calmly took another sip of coffee. For perhaps the first time in years, Raphael experienced the deeply unfamiliar sensation of being read as carefully as he read everyone else, and he wasn't sure whether he hated it. Later that afternoon, Raphael met privately with Gabriel Highland in one of the Hotel's secured conference suites overlooking the river. Vivian had not been invited. That bothered Raphael slightly more than it should have. Gabriel closed the door behind him before speaking. Park Barrett's delaying. Why? He's asking additional questions about prior shipments. Raphael's expression sharpened immediately. What kind of questions? Import manifests, routing patterns, customs timing. That's not negotiation. No. Raphael stood slowly from the leather chair and walked toward the windows. Below them, soul traffic moved endlessly through sheets of gray rain. He's looking for something, Raphael said quietly. Gabriel didn't answer. That silence answered enough. Raphael turned back slowly. What aren't you telling me? Gabriel adjusted his tie once. Local contacts say Barrett's nervous. Nervous about what? They don't know. Raphael stared at him another moment before nodding once. Find out. Gabriel hesitated near the door. There's one more thing. What, Vivian? Raphael's eyes narrowed slightly. What about her? She notices too much. The room cooled immediately. Raphael said nothing. Gabriel shifted carefully beneath the weight of that silence. I'm just saying, interpreters hear everything. Maybe we limit what discussed around her. Raphael looked back toward the city, then answered quietly. She already hears more than most people understand anyway. That ended the conversation. That evening, Vivian chose dinner again. Not a luxury restaurant this time. Not private dining. A tiny place tucked beneath an overpass glowing with warm yellow lights and fogged up windows from steam inside. Raphael stepped out of the car and looked at the location skeptically. You bring all your billionaire clients here? You're not paying for atmosphere tonight. The smell hit him first once they entered. Chili paste, garlic, sweet spice, grilled meat. The restaurant barely held 12 tables. Nobody recognized Raphael. Nobody cared. For reasons he still couldn't explain, he found that strangely relaxing tonight. Vivian ordered without menus again. A few minutes later, steaming bowls of tteokbokki arrived between them thick rice cakes covered in deep red sauce, beside fried vegetables and boiled eggs. Raphael eyed the dish cautiously. This looks dangerous. It is, Vivian said, emotionally. He took one bite, immediately coughed once. Vivian tried and failed not to smile. Too spicy? No. Yes, it is. Raphael took another bite stubbornly. His eyes watered almost instantly. Vivian laughed openly now. You enjoying this way too much. You treating the sauce like a personal enemy. It attacked first. For several minutes, they ate quietly while rain tapped softly against the windows outside. Then Vivian set down her chopsticks. There's a concept you should understand before tomorrow. Raphael looked up carefully. What concept? Nunchi. That S? A word? Yes. What does it mean? Vivian considered the question seriously before answering. There is no perfect English translation. It asks the ability to read a room emotionally, to understand what people feel without them saying it directly. Raphael leaned back slightly. That exists everywhere. Yes, Vivian agreed. But here it is considered intelligence, not intuition. Interesting distinction. Park Barrett will test yours tomorrow, and if I fail, you won tea. You sound confident. Vivian looked at him steadily across the table. Because you've been reading people since the second we met. Raphael frowned slightly. That's business. No, she said quietly. That's survival. The noise of the restaurant blurred briefly around them. Rain. Distant laughter. Dishes clattering softly somewhere behind the kitchen curtain. Raphael held her gaze another second. How do you know that? Vivian tilted her head slightly. Because you notice everything. She paused. You just pretend not to. That landed harder than he expected. Because it was true, and because almost nobody ever said true things directly to Raphael anymore. They either feared him too much or wanted something from him too badly. Vivian, apparently, suffered from neither condition. Near the end of dinner, an older waitress approached their table smiling warmly at Vivian while speaking rapid Korean. Vivian answered immediately. The woman laughed. Vivian laughed too. And once again, Raphael experienced that same strange awareness from lunch the day before. There was another version of this woman he still couldn't fully access. A version untouched by translation. What was that? He asked after the waitress left. She asked if the food was good. And I said, yes, that was enough for all that. Vivian shook her head, slightly amused. She also said Americans always look surprised when spicy food tastes good. Raphael scoffed softly. I'm not American. I told her that. And? I said you were Italian. Raphael reached for his drink. What'd she say? Vivian smiled faintly into her tea. She said that explains the face. What face? The face that says, trying to decide whether you like something, her eyes lifted toward his, even though you already decided 10 minutes ago. For a moment, Raphael simply looked at her across the tiny restaurant table while rain shimmered against Seoul outside. And without warning, he realized something quietly dangerous. He was beginning to look forward to hearing her speak. Raphael Moretti woke a few minutes before midnight with the unpleasant certainty that something was wrong. Not fear. Fear was loud. This feeling was quieter than that. A disturbance in pattern. For 20 years, Raphael had survived by trusting instincts he couldn't always explain. Small shifts. Objects moved half an inch. Conversations that paused 1 second too long. The sense that a room had changed while he wasn't looking directly at it. Tonight, the feeling arrived the second. He opened his eyes inside the dark hotel suite overlooking Seoul. He sat up slowly in bed, listening. Nothing. Rain against the windows, distant traffic below, the muted hum of hotel ventilation. Still wrong. Raphael stood, crossed the suite barefoot, and switched on the small lamp near the luggage rack. His carry-on suitcase sat exactly where he left it. Black leather, combination lock, untouched. At least that was what logic said. Instinct disagreed. For several seconds, he simply stared at it. Then he crouched beside the suitcase and opened it carefully. Everything looked normal at first glance. Shirts folded precisely. Documents aligned. Extra watch case zipped into the side compartment. Toiletries untouched. But Raphael's expression hardened slightly anyway, because one shirt had been folded, facing the opposite direction. Most people would never notice. Raphael noticed everything. Slowly, methodically, he removed every item from the suitcase and placed them onto the bed behind him. 5 minutes later, the suitcase was empty. Almost. Raphael pressed his hand along the bottom lining. There, something uneven beneath the fabric. His jaw tightened. Using a small knife from the desk drawer, he slid the blade carefully beneath the lining and lifted it back just enough to reveal a thin waterproof envelope taped flat against the interior frame. Raphael stared at it silently, then removed it. The envelope felt almost weightless in his hands. Inside was a stack of documents, not English, not Italian, not Korean either. Raphael flipped through several pages, recognizing absolutely nothing except numbers, signatures, and official-looking seals. His pulse slowed instead of quickening. That was always when he became most dangerous. Someone had used him, not openly, not honestly. Used him as transportation, a mule without permission. That alone would have been enough to create consequences. What unsettled Raphael more was the precision of it. Whoever had hidden these documents knew his travel schedule, knew his luggage access, and knew he would clear international transit without random inspection. This wasn't amateur work, it was personal. Raphael looked at the clock beside the bed, 12:14 a.m. Without hesitation, he picked up his phone and made one call. Vivian Cole answered on the second ring, her voice thick with sleep. "Hello? I need you to come upstairs." Silence for half a second, then instantly awake. "What happened? I'm not explaining this over the phone." Another brief pause. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. She arrived in 12. Raphael opened the suite door before she could knock fully. Vivian stepped inside wearing jeans, a dark sweater, and no makeup for the first time since Heidi met her. Her hair remained loose from sleep, falling over one shoulder as she scanned his expression immediately. "You look angry," she said quietly. "I am." That seemed to concern her more than if he'd been shouting. Raphael led her toward the dining table where the documents sat spread beneath warm overhead light. Vivian approached carefully. "What is this?" "That," Raphael said coldly, "is what somebody hid in my luggage." Her eyes lifted sharply toward him. "What? I found it 20 minutes ago." Vivian stared at him another second before pulling out a chair and sitting down beside the papers. Then she began reading. The room fell silent except for pages turning slowly beneath her fingers. Raphael watched her face closely while she translated internally. At first her expression remained professional. Then gradually it changed. Fear, recognition, and that was somehow worse. Finally, Vivian stopped reading altogether. The silence stretched. "Well?" Raphael asked. She looked up carefully. "These are Japanese financial records." "For what?" Vivian hesitated. "That depends how honest you want the answer." Raphael's eyes hardened immediately, the honest one. She nodded once. "These documents detail payments made through shell companies connected to Barrett International Logistics in the late 90s. She turned one page toward him, despite knowing he couldn't read it. Specifically, bribes paid to secure a government construction contract in Busan. Raphael stared at her. How serious? Vivian exhaled slowly. If authentic, she met his eyes directly, enough to destroy Arthur Barrett's company. Possibly enough to send him to prison. The suite became very quiet after that. Rain slid softly against the windows, overlooking the sleeping city. Raphael walked toward the bar cart near the window and poured himself whiskey without offering any. Someone put evidence against Barrett into my suitcase, he said finally. Yes. Meaning either someone wants him blackmailed. Raphael turns slowly back toward her, or someone wants him believing I came here to blackmail him. Vivian folded her hands together carefully, possibly both. Raphael drank once from the glass, hard. His mind already moved 3 directions ahead. Access. Timing. Who packed the suitcase? Who knew the schedule? Who benefited from conflict between him and Barrett? One name surfaced immediately. Daniel. Vivian didn't answer. That answer was enough. Raphael laughed softly once without humor. 8 years working for me. He stared down into the whiskey glass, and he hides documents in my luggage. We don't know if he did it willingly. No, Raphael agreed quietly. We don't tea. Vivian pulls the star carefully now. Not the documents. Him. You trust him, she said. I did. Past tense. The distinction mattered. Vivian looked back down at the papers. Raphaela looked up. What happens now? Interesting question. Not because of the documents, because of her tone. She wasn't asking professionally anymore. She was asking personally. Raphael moved back toward the table slowly. What would you do? Vivian blinked slightly, surprised. You re-asking me? You understand this situation better than anyone else in the room. There are only 2 people in the room. Exactly. That almost earned a smile from her, despite the tension. Almost. Vivian looked down at the Japanese documents again. If Barrett discovers these in your possession before you explains them, he'll assume you brute them intentionally. I know. And if somebody orchestrated that misunderstanding, her eyes lifted carefully, they may not stop with misunderstanding. Raphael nodded once. Correct again. Vivian leaned back slowly in the chair. You need to decide whether you re-treating this like business or a threat. What is the difference? If it's business, you negotiate. She paused. If it's threat, you survive. The words settled heavily between them. Raphael studied her face quietly for several seconds, then asked this question that had been forming since she entered the room. Why are you helping me? Vivian looked genuinely confused. Because you called me. No, Raphael said softly. I mean this. He gestured toward the documents, toward the danger, toward the invisible line she had now crossed simply by reading them. You could have all walked out the second and you understood what this was. Vivian looked at him steadily across the table. You didn't know those documents were there. That's not an answer. Yes, it is. The room fell silent again. Raphael realized then something deeply inconvenient. He believed her, not completely. Raphael Moretti trusted almost nobody completely. But enough. Enough to matter. Vivian finally spoke again, quieter this time. I need to ask you something. Go ahead. What exactly did you do? There it was. Not accusation, not fear. A real question. Raphael stared at the rain outside before answering. I moved things. Vivian waited. Expensive things, he added calmly, across borders. Sometimes through routes governments don't officially appreciate. And Arthur Barrett? Legitimate shipping on paper. Raphael's eyes darkened slightly. Less legitimate underneath. Vivian absorbed that quietly, then asked the only question that truly mattered. Are you the kind of man who would use those documents against him? Raphael answered immediately. No. And if someone else wanted you to? His gaze met hers directly. No. Vivian held his eyes another moment longer than necessary, reading him again, measuring tone, breath. Silence. Finally, she nodded once. Then tomorrow, she said quietly, we go to the meeting. And you let me handle the language. For the first time that night, Raphael felt something inside him settle slightly. Not safety, not peace, just certainty. And in his world, certainty was sometimes the closest thing a man ever got. Morning arrived in Seoul, wrapped in cold rain and low gray clouds that made the city look softer from a distance than it actually was. Raphael Moretti stood beside the hotel window adjusting the cuff of his dark charcoal suit while traffic crawled far below through wet streets. He had slept less than 2 hours, though nobody looking at him would have known it. Men like Raphael learned early that exhaustion was a private matter. Behind him, Vivian Cole sat at the dining table, reviewing handwritten notes from the previous day's negotiations. She had changed into a cream-colored blouse and dark slacks, her hair tied loosely back this morning, glasses low on her nose while she read. The scene looked strangely domestic. That realization irritated Raphael immediately. Arthur moved the meeting location, Vivian said without looking up. To where? Private conference floor at the Meridian Tower. Not his main office. Raphael buttoned his jacket slowly. That means he's nervous. Yes, or angry. Vivian finally glanced up. Both can be true. Raphael gave a faint nod. That was something he just started noticing about her. She never rushed to fill silence, never softened a truth unnecessarily. Most people around powerful men spent entire conversations trying not to upset them. Vivian seemed more interested in accuracy than survival. It was becoming dangerously easy to trust her. You didn't sleep, she observed quietly. You did? A little. That's disappointing. I was hoping you were as miserable as I am. To his surprise, she laughed softly. Real laughter. Not polite. It changed her entire face when she did that. Raphael looked away first. 20 minutes later, they were inside the back of a black sedan, moving through the rainy streets toward Meridian Tower. The documents were gone. Not destroyed, not abandoned. Transferred overnight to someone Raphael trusted in New York, far more than anyone currently standing in Seoul. Vivian sat beside him, reviewing final notes for the negotiation, while rain tapped softly against the windows. After several minutes, Raphael spoke without looking at her. If something changes in that room today, I want to know immediately. Vivian kept reading. That's usually how interpreting works. Serious. So am I. Raphael finally turned toward her. If Barrett says something off record, if somebody references the documents, if there is a second conversation happening underneath the official one, his voice lowered slightly. I need to hear all of it. Vivian closed the folder slowly. That's not entirely ethical. I am not asking you to manipulate anything. You're asking me to choose your side. Raphael considered that carefully, then shook his head. No, I am asking you to tell me the truth in real time. For several seconds, she studied him quietly, then nodded once. Okay. The sedan pulled beneath the underground entrance of Meridian Tower. The meeting room on the 43rd floor was colder than expected. Not temperature, atmosphere. Arthur Barrett stood near the far windows overlooking Seoul, with two attorneys beside him and a financial advisor seated near the end of the long table. He turned as Raphael entered, offering the polished smile of a man who had spent 40 years weaponizing charm. But Raphael noticed something immediately. Arthur's eyes moved first to Vivian, not him. Interesting. Vivian noticed it too. Tom Bennett, Arthur's personal interpreter, for the Korean side of the contract, stood near the wall, organizing papers nervously. Everybody in the room looked slightly tense except Arthur himself, which meant Arthur already knew something the others didn't. Raphael, Arthur said warmly, extending his hand. Glad we could continue this privately. Raphael shook it once. Likewise. Arthur's gaze shifted briefly toward Vivian. And you must be Miss Cole. Vivian is fine. Excellent credentials, Arthur said smoothly. I looked you up last night. Raphael felt the slightest tightening in the room beside him. Not fear, discomfort. Vivian smiled politely. That's flattering and mildly unsettling. Arthur laughed. Raphael didn't. The meeting began formally enough. Shipping routes, import schedules, port distribution. Numbers moved calmly across documents while rain streaked the windows behind them. But underneath the official conversation, another negotiation had already started. Raphael could feel it. Vivian could hear it. About 40 minutes into the meeting, Arthur leaned toward one of his Korean advisors and spoke quietly in Korean not intended for Raphael to understand. Tom hesitated slightly before translating only part of it aloud. Vivian did not hesitate. Without changing expression, she leaned subtly toward Raphael and spoke under her breath. He asked if your luggage was searched when you arrived in Seoul. Raphael kept his face perfectly still. There it is. He continued reviewing the contract calmly. Did Tom translate all of it? He asked quietly. No, what did he leave out? Vivian's eyes remained on her notes. He also asked whether you brought the package into the building today. Interesting, very, Arthur knew. Not specifics, maybe, but enough. Raphael folded his hands together slowly and finally spoke across the table. I think, he said evenly, we should stop talking around each other. Arthur's eyes lifted immediately. Vivian translated, but Raphael noticed something subtle in her Korean phrasing. One additional expression at the end of the sentence. A cultural adjustment, not literal translation. Arthur reacted instantly to it. His relaxed posture disappeared. Now he was listening carefully, Arthur replied in Korean, longer this time. Tom began translating formally, but Vivian spoke quietly to Raphael before Tom finished. He says he believes there's been a misunderstanding regarding the purpose of your visit. Raphael nodded once. Tell him I agree. Vivian translated. Arthur leaned back slowly in his chair. Then came the moment the entire trip tilted sideways. Arthur spoke directly now, not to Tom, not to the lawyers, to Raphael, in Korean, and Vivian translated every word. I was informed, Arthur said through her voice, that you arrived in Seoul carrying material capable of severely damaging my company, and several people connected to it. The room became very still. One attorney stopped writing completely. Tom looked pale. Raphael answered calmly. I discovered material in my luggage that does not belong to me. Vivian translated flawlessly. I did not request it. I did not transport it knowingly. And I have no interest in using it against you. Arthur watched him carefully while Vivian spoke. Raphael continued. I came to Seoul for business. That remains my intention. Whether you believe, that is now your decision. When Vivian finished translating, silence filled the room. Arthur stared at Raphael for several long seconds. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. Not happily. Almost tired. He said something quietly in Korean. Tom looked confused.
Vivi translated.
He says that in 40 years of international business, most men lie before they need to. He finds it unusual that you waited until it became dangerous to tell the truth. Raphael almost smiled himself at that. Almost. Arthur leaned forward slowly. Where are the documents now? Safe. Can I see them? No. The honesty of the answer seemed to amuse Arthur more than anger him. Rain continued sliding against the windows while both men studied each other carefully across the table. Not enemies exactly. Not allies either. Just two experienced men realizing somebody else had tried very hard to turn them into weapons against each other. Finally, Arthur nodded once. Then perhaps, Vivian translated softly, we continue discussing the contract. And somehow they did. For another hour the meeting shifted back toward business, though everything underneath it had changed. The hostility was gone now, replaced by caution, calculation, mutual curiosity. By the time signatures were postponed for final review, the atmosphere had become almost strangely respectful. As everyone began gathering papers, Arthur spoke one final sentence in Korean while looking directly at Raphael. Vivian listened, then translated quietly. He says someone tried very hard to create a war between the two of you, and whoever failed is probably disappointed right now. Raphael stood slowly. He's right. Arthur gave a small nod, then the meeting ended. Back inside the elevator, descending toward the parking garage, silence stretched between Raphael and Vivian for nearly 20 floors. Finally, Raphael spoke. The phrase you added earlier. Vivian looked at him carefully. What phrase? The one that changed his reaction. A pause. Then understanding crossed her face. Oh, what did you say? Vivian adjusted the strap of her bag lightly. I told him you wanted to speak honestly. You changed my wording. I adjusted your intent. Raphael stared at the glowing elevator numbers another moment. You do that often? All good interpreters do. I didn't hire an interpreter to improvise. No, Vivian said calmly. You hired one to prevent disasters caused by literal translation. The elevator doors opened, neither moved immediately. Then Raphael gave the smallest nod, annoyed, impressed, maybe both. Next time, he said quietly, warn me before you save the negotiation. For the first time all morning, Vivian smiled openly. Fair enough. The hotel bar on the 42nd floor was nearly empty after midnight. Soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers. Rain still clung to the windows overlooking Seoul, turning the city lights into blurred ribbons of gold and white below the glass. A bartender polished glasses without interest, while two businessmen at the far corner spoke quietly in Japanese. Raphael Moretti sat alone near the window with a half-finished glass of whiskey in front of him. He rarely drank alone. Men in his position learned quickly that solitude and alcohol were a dangerous combination. One loosened discipline, the other invited memory. Tonight he allowed himself both. His tie had disappeared hours ago. The top button of his shirt remained undone, sleeves rolled once at the forearms. To most people he still looked controlled. Vivian Cole noticed immediately that he was T. She paused at the entrance to the bar when she saw him there. For a second, she considered leaving. Then Raphael glanced up. Their eyes met across the room. "You're still awake," she said as she approached. "So are you." That's less surprising. Something about that answer almost made him smile. Almost. Vivian stopped beside the table. "Mind if I sit?" Raphael gestured toward the empty chair across from him. "Depends. Are you here professionally or personally?" Vivian settled slowly into the chair. "At this hour? I honestly don't know anymore." That answer lingered between them longer than either expected. The bartender approached. Vivian ordered red wine. Raphael ordered another whiskey without asking if she minded him continuing. She appreciated that. There was something exhausting about men who performed politeness instead of understanding it naturally. For several minutes, they simply sat there listening to the rain against the windows. No negotiation, no contracts, no translation, just silence. Oddly comfortable silence. Finally, Raphael spoke. "When I was a kid," he said quietly, still looking out at the city, "my father used to say Naples sounded different at night." Vivian leaned back slightly, listening. "He said during the day the city belonged to business, but at night," Raphael shrugged faintly, "night belonged to people telling the truth." Vivian smiled softly. "That sounds Italian." It was. Raphael took another drink. "My father believed language changed after midnight. Said people stop speaking professionally once they get tired enough." "That's actually true," Vivian said. "Most people become more emotionally honest when exhausted. Interpreters notice it constantly." Raphael glanced at her. "You notice everything constantly. That's also true." For the first time all evening, he smiled fully, small, real, dangerous. Vivian looked away first. Raphael continued staring out toward the rain-covered skyline. "I hated Seoul the first day I got here." Vivian raised an eyebrow. "You hide it well. I don't like needing people. That explains a lot." Raphael laughed quietly through his nose. "You always answer questions like that? You always say things that sound like confessions without technically being confessions?" That one landed harder than he expected. Raphael looked down in his glass, then spoke softly in Italian without thinking. "Quando ero giovane, pensavo che il potere significasse non aver bisogno di nessuno." When I was young, I thought power meant never needing anyone. Vivian answered immediately. "Invecchiando, si scopre quasi sempre il contrario." As you get older, you almost always discover the opposite. Everything inside Raphael went completely still. Slowly, very slowly, he lifted his eyes toward her. Vivian realized too late what she'd done. The silence that followed was enormous. "You speak Italian," Raphael said quietly. Not a question. Vivian held his gaze. "How long?" "My mother married an Italian architect when I was 8. She spoke carefully now. We moved to Rome for 12 years. Raphael stared at her in absolute disbelief. "You've understood every word I've said in Italian this entire week." "Yes." The whiskey suddenly tasted different in his mouth. Raphael leaned back slowly in his chair. Something sharp moved behind his eyes now. Not anger exactly. Betrayal, maybe. Or embarrassment. Worse than both. "How long were you planning to keep that to yourself?" Vivian folded her hands calmly in front of her. "I was to planning anything." "That's not an answer," she admitted softly. "It's not." Raphael looked away toward the rain again, jaw tightening. "You listen to private conversations." "Yes." "You listen to me speak to my men in Italian while pretending not to understand." "Yes." "You should have told me immediately." I know that answer disarmed him more than defensiveness would have. Vivian didn't try to justify herself immediately. She simply sat there, accepting the weight of what she'd done. Finally, Raphael spoke again. "Why?" Vivian exhaled quietly. "Because when people think you don't understand them," she paused carefully. "They stop performing." Raphael's eyes narrowed slightly. "And I was performing at first?" "Constantly." That irritated him. Mostly because it was true. Vivian continued carefully. "You speak differently in English than you do in Italian. Everybody does." "No," she said softly. "Not like you." The bartender delivered her wine. Neither touched their drinks. Vivian looked down briefly before continuing.
In English, you control rooms.
Every sentence is measured. Strategic. Her eyes lifted back toward him. In Italian, you say what you actually feel before you decide whether it is safe. Raphael stared at her silently. You analyzed me, I listened to you. That's not better. No, Vivian admitted. Probably not. Another long silence settled between them. Then Raphael asked quietly, "What exactly did you hear?" Vivian hesitated for the first time all night. "That depends. On what? On whether you actually want the answer." Raphael held her gaze steadily. "I do." Vivian nodded slowly. "You talked about your father more than once." Something flickered behind Raphael's expression immediately. "You said he would have known what to do here." Her voice softened slightly. "You said he always understood how to survive in rooms where he didn't belong." Raphael looked down at the table. "And? You said you never learned how." That one landed deep. Deep enough that Raphael physically leaned back slightly afterward, like he'd been struck somewhere invisible. Rain pressed softly against the windows behind them. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Raphael asked the question almost reluctantly. "What else?" Vivian watched him carefully. "You worried about trusting the wrong people." A pause. "And you worried about trusting the right ones too late." Raphael let out a quiet breath through his nose. "Jesus Christ. That's approximately what I thought while listening." Despite himself, he laughed once. Short, tired, real. Vivian relaxed slightly after hearing it. Then Raphael looked at her again.
You should told me.
"Yes, why now?" For the first time that evening, Vivian looked in uncertain, not professionally uncertain, personally. "Because yesterday," she said quietly, "you told Arthur Barrett the truth when lying would have been easier." Raphael said nothing, and I realized I was doing the opposite. The honesty of that settled heavily between them. No manipulation, no strategy, just truth. Raphael studied her face carefully now, like he was seeing it differently for the first time. Not translator, not employee, not temporary contractor, a woman who had been quietly understanding him for days without permission. That should have made him furious. Instead, it made him feel strangely exposed. "You're Italian," he said finally. "Where in Rome?" "Trastevere, mostly. That explains the accent." "You noticed?" "I notice everything." Vivian smiled faintly into her wineglass. "Yes," she said softly. "I know." Another silence followed, but now it felt different, closer, more dangerous. Raphael looked toward the rain-covered city again. "When your stepfather died," he asked quietly, "did you stay in Italy?" "For 3 years. Why?" Vivian stared down at the wine before answering. "Because I didn't know who I was in Korean anymore." Raphael understood that immediately, in a way most people wouldn't. "What changed?" "You eventually missed the first language you ever dreamed in." Raphael looked back toward her slowly. "What was yours, Korean? And now?" Vivian smiled sadly. "Now I think it depends who I'm talking to." That answer stayed with Raphael longer than anything else she said all night. Somewhere below them, Seoul continued moving, through rain and midnight traffic and ordinary life. But inside the quiet hotel bar, something irreversible had shifted between them. Not romance, not yet, something more dangerous than that. Recognition. Chapter 7. What Arthur Barrett Knows. By the following morning, the rain over Seoul had stopped, but the city still looked washed in silver. The streets below the hotel reflected pale sunlight like wet glass, and the air carried that strange quiet that only comes after a storm. Raphael Moretti stood near the window of his suite, with his phone pressed against his ear, listening without speaking while one of his men in New York updated him on shipping schedules he no longer cared about. His attention stayed on the reflection behind him instead. Vivian Cole sat at the dining table, reviewing notes from the previous day's negotiation with Arthur Barrett. Her dark hair was tied loosely back this morning, reading glasses low on her nose as she marked small handwritten corrections beside translated legal phrases. Calm, focused, completely unaware she was being watched, or pretending not to notice. With Vivian, Raphael still hadn't figured out which possibility was more dangerous. He ended the call quietly. "You've been staring at the same paragraph for 10 minutes, he said. Vivian didn't look up. Because it was written by an American lawyer trying to sound intelligent in front of Korean executives. That bad? Worse. He used the word synergy 4 times in one page. That earned a tired laugh from Raphael. Then his expression darkened again. There's a problem. Vivian finally looked up. That sentence usually means somebody s about to bleed. Hopefully not today. She removed her glasses slowly. What happened? Raphael crossed the room and handed her his phone. A message glowed on the screen. Arthur Barrett request private meeting tonight. No interpreter necessary. Vivian read it twice, then looked up carefully. He specifically requested no interpreter? Yes. That S, not subtle. No. She handed the phone back slowly. Arthur Barrett had spent 40 years building one of the most powerful logistics empires in East Asia. Men like him rarely asked for private meetings unless they intended to remove witnesses from the room. And right now, Vivian understood something uncomfortable very clearly. She was the witness. Raphael watched the realization settle across her face. He thinks you know too much, he said quietly. Vivian leaned back in the chair. He's probably right. That does make you expendable. Their eyes met briefly. The sentence landed harder than either expected. Vivian looked away first. What are you going to do? I'm going to meet him without me. Raphael didn't answer immediately. That was answer enough. Vivian stood slowly from the table. That's a mistake. Maybe. You can to read that room without someone translating context. I've survived rooms before, that's not the point. Her voice sharpened slightly now. You survived because you understood power. This isn't about power anymore. It's about information. Raphael moved closer, and information is exactly why I'm not bringing you. Vivian folded her arms. You think he'll threaten me? I think men protecting 30 years of corruption become unpredictable when cornered. And what exactly do you become when cornered? The question stopped him cold. For a second, neither moved. Then Raphael looked away toward the window. That depends who is standing next to me. Silence. Dangerous silence. Vivian understood then that this conversation had quietly stopped being professional several days ago. Neither of them knew what to do about that yet. Before either could speak again, Raphael's second phone vibrated. Only 3 people had that number. He answered immediately. Talk. Hyun Park's voice came through low and urgent. Arthur's nephew approached me this morning. Raphael's expression hardened. He says his uncle is making a mistake. Vivian watched Raphael carefully now, reading the tension in his shoulders even without hearing the other side of the conversation. What exactly did he say? Raphael asked. Hyun hesitated. He said your interpreter is becoming a liability. Across the room, Vivian went very still. Raphael's eyes lifted slowly toward her. What else? He thinks Arthur believes she heard more during the meetings than she translated. Raphael's jaw tightened. She did. Another silence on the line. Finally, Hyun spoke again. I think the nephew is trying to help, or trying to measure how nervous we are. That too. Raphael ended the call without goodbye. The room suddenly felt smaller. Vivian crossed her arms tighter now. So that S where we are. Raphael looked at her directly. No, you're not a liability. Vivian gave him a thin look. That S very flattering considering the circumstances. I am serious. You should probably stop saying things like that. Why? Because I am starting to believe you. That one hit harder than either expected. Raphael stared at her for a long second, then finally exhaled through his nose and reached for his jacket. You re-changing hotels tonight? Vivian blinked once. That's unnecessary. No, it's not. Raphael, I'm not debating this. The in his voice filled the room instantly. Not shouting. Worse, controlled authority. Vivian studied him carefully. Then, unexpectedly, she softened, not surrendering. Understanding. You re-worried about me. Raphael adjusted his cufflinkings without looking at her. I'm managing risk. A small smile touched her mouth. Those aren't always different things. For the first time all morning, Raphael looked genuinely caught off guard. Vivian grabbed her notebook from the table. Fine. Different hotel. She paused. But I'm still coming to the meeting tomorrow, obviously. The answer came too fast, too naturally. Vivian noticed, so did he. Hours later, after sunset settled over Seoul again, Vivian left the hotel alone, through a private side entrance arranged by Raphael's security team. A black sedan waited near the curb to move her to another location across the river. Before she reached the car, someone stepped quietly from the shadows beside the alley. Miss Cole? Vivian stopped immediately. Young, male, mid-30s. Arthur Barrett's nephew, Thomas Barrett. He looked nervous enough to sweat through his coat, despite the cold air. You shouldn't be here, Vivian said calmly. I know then this conversation is already a bad idea. Thomas glanced at him before speaking again. My uncle is a violent man. Vivian almost smiled. That's usually the sentence people say right before describing violence. Thomas rubbed his face tiredly. He made mistakes a long time ago. Bad ones. But he spent 30 years protecting thousands of employees because of those mistakes. Families depend on that company. And now he thinks Raphael is threatening it. Yes. Vivian studied him carefully. Unlike Arthur, Thomas still carried visible guilt in his expression. Men like Arthur learned decades ago how to bury guilt beneath authority. Younger men hadn't mastered that yet. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked quietly. Thomas hesitated, "Because I don't think your boss is the real target." Vivian's eyes narrowed slightly. "Explain, the document, the anonymous warnings, the pressure on both sides." Thomas shook his head. "It feels manufactured, too convenient." Vivian had been thinking the exact same thing for almost 24 hours. Thomas continued carefully. "My uncle thinks someone wanted Raphael angry enough to retaliate. And you? I think someone wanted both men distracted while another deal happened somewhere else." That landed hard. Vivian stared at him silently now. Because that theory made terrifying sense. Thomas saw it in her face immediately. "You've been thinking that too?" "Yes." "Then help them stop this before somebody escalates it into something worse." Vivian looked toward the waiting sedan, then back at Thomas. "You asking me to mediate between two men who built their entire careers on not trusting anyone." Thomas gave a tired smile. "You seem unusually qualified for that." For the first time all day, Vivian laughed quietly, short, real. Then she opened the car door. "I'll tell Raphael exactly what you said." Thomas nodded gratefully. "One more thing." Vivian paused. "My uncle doesn't fear prison," Thomas said softly. "He fears humiliation." She studied him carefully.
Those are usually connected.
Yes, Thomas admitted quietly, but not always equally. Vivian got into the car without another word. As the sedan disappeared into Seoul traffic, she stared out the window, thinking about Raphael Moretti, about language, about trust, and about the terrifying intimacy of being understood by someone dangerous. Back at the hotel, Raphael stood alone near the window again when she finally returned 2 hours later. He turned the moment she entered. "Well?" Vivian removed her coat slowly, then told him everything Thomas had said. Exactly, word for word. Raphael listened without interrupting once. When she finished, silence filled the room again. Finally he spoke. "You think he's right?" "Yes." "You think somebody engineered this entire situation?" "Yes." Raphael looked down briefly, thinking. Then he laughed once under his breath. Not amused, just exhausted. "You know what the worst part is?" "What?" He looked back up at her. "I think we finally asking the right questions." Raphael Moretti slept less than 2 hours that night. By dawn, he was already dressed, standing barefoot near the hotel window with a black coffee cooling untouched in his hand while Seoul slowly brightened beneath him. The city looked deceptively peaceful from 40 floors above the streets. Quiet trains moved between towers. Early traffic rolled beneath soft gray fog. Ordinary people carried ordinary problems into ordinary mornings. Raphael envied them briefly. Then his phone vibrated. Marco. For several seconds, Raphael simply stared at the screen. Vivian sat across the suite reviewing notes from yesterday's CS meetings when she noticed the change in his expression. "That him?" Raphael nodded once. He answered immediately. "Talk." Marco's breathing came first, uneven, nervous. The breathing of a man who had spent several days rehearsing lies before finally deciding the truth might hurt less. "Rafe Dante, call me that right now." Silence. Then Marco exhaled shakily. "I didn't know what was in the envelope." Raphael said nothing, because rage was easier to control than disappointment, and right now disappointment was winning. Marco continued carefully. "Well, they came to me 3 weeks ago." "Who?" "I don't know. That ass not us an answer. It's the only one I got." Raphael turned away from the window slowly. Vivian watched him closely now, reading tension in the lines of his shoulders. "What exactly happened?" Raphael asked. Marco swallowed audibly on the line. "They had photographs, old records, things from 10 years ago." Raphael closed his eyes briefly. "Everyone had something from 10 years ago. Everyone. What did they want?" "They told me to place a package in your luggage before Seoul." Marco's voice cracked slightly. "That's all. And you did it." "I thought it was money laundering paperwork. Shipping leverage, maybe. I didn't know it was political." Raphael's voice dropped lower. You used me. I know. You put something in my suitcase without my knowledge and sent me into another country carrying blackmail material. I know. And then you disappeared. They told me if I warned you, my daughter's medical records would become public. That stopped the room cold. Even Vivian looked up sharply now. Marco continued speaking quickly, almost desperately. She's applying to colleges, Raphael. If those records got out, his breathing shook again. You know what people do with weakness. Raphael did know. Men in his world weaponized vulnerability constantly. Children suffered for the sins of fathers every day. That reality didn't make betrayal easier to swallow. You should come to me, Raphael said quietly. I know you trusted strangers over me. No, Marco's voice broke. I trusted fear over loyalty. There's a difference. That line lingered heavily in the silence. Because it was honest. Painfully honest. Raphael rubbed one hand slowly across his jaw. Did you ever hear their names? No. Voices? One man mostly. What kind of accent? Marco hesitated. Italian. Raphael's eyes narrowed immediately. From where? That S the strange part. Marco paused carefully. It sounded northern, but not real northern Italian. Learned. Vivian slowly set down her pen. Every instinct inside her sharpened instantly. Put him on speaker, she said quietly. Raphael did. Vivian moved closer. Marco, she said calmly, I need you to think carefully before answering. Did the speaker stress vowels sharply or softly? Marco blinked audibly through the silence. What? The accent. Think about rhythm, not pronunciation. Marco hesitated. Sharp, very sharp. Vivian nodded slowly to herself. Germanic language base, she murmured. Raphael looked toward her immediately. What does that mean? It means Italian probably wasn't his second language. Vivian crossed her arms, thinking fast now. Could be German. Dutch. Flemish, maybe. Marco spoke again. He rolled his RS too hard. Vivian nodded instantly. Definitely learned later in life. Raphael stared at her. How the hell do you know that? Vivian barely looked up, because languages leave fingerprints. That sentence sat heavily in the room. Marco spoke again carefully. There's something else. Raphael's expression hardened. What? The man knew your soul schedule before your office finalized it publicly. Silence. Real silence this time. Vivian slowly looked toward Raphael. Someone inside Raphael understood it immediately too. Not random competitors, not Arthur Barrett, someone with access. Someone close enough to see internal schedules before confirmation. Marco kept talking nervously. I swear to God, Raphael, I never meant for this to happen. Raphael's voice turned cold again. But it did happen. Another silence. Then Marco spoke softly. I'm sorry. Raphael closed his eyes briefly. The worst apologies were the sincere ones, because anger had nowhere clean to land afterward. Finally, Raphael answered. When I get back to New York, we'll discuss the rest. Marco breathed shakily. You not going to kill me? Raphael looked toward the gray skyline outside, then toward Vivian. No, he said quietly. Not this time. He ended the call. The suite fell silent again. Vivian studied him carefully. You meant that? Yes. You surprised yourself, a little. Raphael sat heavily into the chair across from her, suddenly looking older than he had all week. Not weaker. Just tired in a way power couldn't hide anymore. Vivian watched him quietly. You know what bothers you most? She asked softly. That he betrayed me? No. Raphael looked up. It's that he was afraid to trust you with the truth. That hit immediately because it was correct. Raphael leaned back slowly. Fear makes people stupid. No, Vivian said gently. Fear makes people lonely. The room went still again. Then Raphael's phone rang once more. Hyun, Raphael answered. What now? Hyun sounded breathless. Thomas Barrett convinced Arthur to meet privately. Raphael frowned. Why? Because Thomas believes both sides are being manipulated. Vivian closed her eyes briefly. Same conclusion again. Independent confirmation. That mattered. When? Raphael asked. 1 hour. Who's attending? You, Arthur, Thomas. Hyun paused, and Vivian. Raphael looked toward her immediately. Interesting. Arthur Barrett had spent the last 24 hours trying to remove her from the situation. Now he specifically wanted her present. That meant something had changed. Vivian understood it too. Thomas convinced him, she said quietly. Probably, Raphael agreed. An hour later, they met inside a private tea room hidden behind one of Arthur Barrett's executive offices overlooking Gangnam. No lawyers, no assistants, no bodyguards inside the room. Just 4 people seated around a low wooden table, while rain clouds drifted slowly over Seoul beyond the windows. Arthur Barrett looked older today. Not physically, emotionally. Like a man beginning to realize control had become impossible. Thomas sat beside him quietly. Vivian beside Raphael. Arthur spoke first in Korean. Vivian translated carefully. He says this situation has become larger than business. Raphael answered calmly. That happened the moment someone used me without my permission. Vivian translated. Arthur nodded once, then spoke again. Thomas watched his uncle carefully now, almost nervously. Vivian listened, then translated slowly. He says he received anonymous warnings 3 weeks ago, claiming an American mafia broker was bringing evidence to Seoul to destroy him publicly. Raphael's expression darkened slightly. Same timeline as Marco. Vivian translated. Arthur nodded again. Thomas finally spoke in English. Someone wanted both of you suspicious enough to destroy the partnership before negotiations finished. Raphael leaned back slowly. And while we were distracted, Thomas nodded grimly. A European logistics group acquired 2 smaller shipping routes through Busan last week. There it was. Finally. The real answer. No revenge, no grand conspiracy, just business. Cold, efficient, profitable business. Raphael stared down at the table for several seconds, then unexpectedly laughed once under his breath. Arthur frowned slightly. Vivian looked toward Raphael carefully. What? Raphael shook his head slowly. It's always disappointing when the answer turns out ordinary. Vivian almost smiled. The biggest crimes usually are. Arthur watched the two of them silently for a moment, then said something quietly in Korean. Vivian translated. He says, perhaps the two of you understand each other unusually well. Raphael looked toward her. Vivian calmly reached for her tea. Neither answered. The meeting room overlooking Seoul was quiet in the way only expensive places could afford to be: thick carpets, soft lighting, and glass walls that turned the city outside into a distant painting of movement and light. Arthur Barrett sat at one end of the low wooden table, hands folded carefully, his expression controlled but no longer confident. Thomas sat beside him, tense but attentive, like a man standing too close to a collapsing structure he had tried to warn others about. Raphael Moretti sat opposite them, perfectly still, while Vivian Cole remained slightly behind his shoulder, not subordinate, not equal, but positioned exactly where interpretation became influence. Arthur spoke first. Vivian translated. He says the misunderstanding has gone far beyond business negotiations, she said calmly. Raphael nodded once. There was no misunderstanding on my side. Vivian translated that too, without hesitation. Arthur's jaw tightened slightly. Thomas leaned forward. He spoke in English this time, carefully measured. My uncle believes someone is deliberately escalating tension between all parties involved. Raphael's eyes narrowed slightly. Vivian translated. Arthur responded quickly, voice lower now, more serious. Vivian listened carefully before speaking again. He says the document in your possession was never meant to reach souls in the first place. Raphael leaned back slightly in his chair. That's the first accurate thing anyone has said in days. Vivian translated it exactly. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable, strategic. Then Thomas spoke again. I think we were all reacting to the same manipulation. Raphael studied him for a long moment, then turned slightly toward Vivian. What does he mean by same manipulation? Vivian paused briefly, choosing precision over speed. He believes someone engineered the conflict so that both sides would weaken each other while a third party secured financial advantage. Raphael exhaled slowly through his nose, so Marco was never the target. Vivian translated. Arthur reacted immediately, speaking sharply in Korean. Vivian translated without softening it. He says Marco was only a tool. Raphael nodded once. That part I already understood. Arthur leaned forward slightly now. His voice shifted. Not aggressive, honest. Vivian translated carefully. He says he received anonymous warnings suggesting that you were bringing blackmail material into his country. Raphael looked at him directly. And you believed it? Arthur didn't answer immediately. Then Thomas spoke quietly. We didn't know what to believe. That was the point. Vivian translated. The silence that followed felt heavier this time. Raphael's gaze moved briefly to Vivian, not for translation, but for confirmation. She met his eyes briefly and gave the smallest nod. Yes, that made sense. Arthur continued speaking. Vivian translated again. He says whoever did this understood both of your industries well enough to predict your actions. Raphael let out a short, humorless breath. That S not prediction, he said. That S exploitation. Vivian translated. Thomas nodded. That's why I think stopping the negotiation entirely would be the wrong move. Arthur turned toward his nephew sharply. Thomas continued, Steady now. If we stop, they win. If we continue blindly, they win. The only way out is to identify the source. Vivian translated carefully. Arthur went silent for a long moment, then slowly nodded. Finally, agreement. Raphael looked toward Vivian again. What are they not saying? He asked quietly. Vivian hesitated. This was the first real test of the space she occupied between them. Translator, filter, witness. She chose honesty. Arthur believes the European logistics group is more coordinated than they appear, she said. But he also thinks there may be someone inside both your networks feeding them information. Raphael's expression darkened slightly. So internal breach, Vivian nodded. Arthur spoke again. Vivian translated. He suggests a temporary alliance until the source is identified. Raphael didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at Arthur for a long moment, then at Thomas. Then finally, at Vivian. You realize what you're re-asking, he said quietly. Vivian translated. Arthur nodded once. Raphael leaned forward slightly now, and if I agree, I'm entrusting a man who just tried to remove me from his country 2 days ago. Vivian translated carefully. Arthur didn't deny it. That honesty mattered. Thomas spoke again quickly. I think both of you already lost the ability to avoid each other. The only question is whether you control what happens next. Vivian translated. Silence again. This time shorter, more focused. Raphael slowly reached for his glass of water, then set it down untouched. Finally he spoke. One condition. Vivian translated immediately. Arthur nodded. Raphael's eyes shifted briefly toward Vivian before returning to Arthur. She stays. Vivian froze slightly. Arthur frowned. Thomas looked confused. Vivian translated carefully. Arthur hesitated, then nodded once. Agreed. Raphael didn't look at Vivian this time when he spoke again, but his voice softened slightly, because she hears what neither of you are saying. Vivian translated it exactly. No one argued, because it was true. Outside the glass walls, Seoul continued moving cars, rain, light, distance. Inside the room, 4 people had just agreed on something fragile, not peace, not trust, something more temporary. A controlled survival arrangement built on shared uncertainty. Vivian closed her notebook slowly. For the first time since arriving in Seoul, she understood the real translation happening in the room. It wasn't tea between English, Korean, or Italian. It was between fear and control, and she was the only one fluent in both. The morning of departure arrived quietly, without ceremony, as if the entire experience in Seoul had been carefully folded back into normal life and placed out of sight. The negotiations were complete. The documents were signed. The European interference had been identified and contained. What remained now was only the aftermath, what people usually called closure, though none of them felt it was truly that. Raphael Moretti stood near the airport terminal window at Incheon, watching planes move with mechanical patience across the runway. For a man who had always controlled movement, money, goods, people, there was something unfamiliar about watching the world operate without his influence. Vivian Coles stood a few steps away, holding her travel bag. She looked composed, but there was a quiet distance in her eyes now, the kind that appears when temporary alliances begin to dissolve back into separate lives. You leaving for Rome, Raphael said. Yes, Vivian replied. 2 weeks, maybe longer. He nodded slowly, as if calculating something he could not quite define. And after that, I go where the next contract is. A pause. Raphael shifted his weight slightly, then spoke again. I have a meeting in Milan in 2 months. Vivian looked at him, not surprised, not impressed, just observant. You don't need me for Italian, she said. No, he answered. That single word hung between them longer than expected. Vivian studied him carefully. So what exactly are you asking for? Raphael didn't answer immediately. For once, he looked like a man trying to translate himself internally before speaking out loud. I don't know the word for it, he finally said. That's the problem. Vivian's expression softened slightly, not into sentiment, but recognition. She understood what he meant without needing clarification, because some requests were in T contracts, and some dependencies were in T weaknesses. They were acknowledgments. She opened her notebook slowly, the same one she had carried through every conversation in Seoul, the same one that had once functioned as a barrier between her and the people she interpreted for. She wrote something down, carefully, deliberately, then tore the page out. She handed it to him. Raphael looked at it. The writing was not a translation of words, it was a translation of meaning, compressed into something only she could have chosen. He frowned slightly. What does it say? Vivian paused, then answered simply. It says you finally learned what you were missing, but you still don't know how to ask for it properly. Raphael looked at her for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. Not the kind used in negotiations, not the kind used in control, something smaller, more human. I'll figure it out, he said. I know, she replied. A final announcement echoed through the terminal. Vivian adjusted her bag. Raphael stepped slightly closer, not enough to break distance, but enough to acknowledge it. You always translate people correctly, he said. I try. No, he corrected gently, you do. That was the closest thing to gratitude he could offer without turning it into a transaction. She nodded once, then walked away. No dramatic goodbye, no promise of return. Just two people moving in different directions after briefly existing in the same language. Raphael remained at the glass window long after she disappeared into security. In his pocket, he held the page she had written. He didn't understand every part of it yet, but he understood enough. And for a man who had spent his life believing control was everything, that was the first time he realized something else mattered more. Understanding what you never had the words to ask for. Outside, another plane lifted into the sky, and for the first time in a long time, Raphael didn't try to control where it was going. This book is a work of imagination. Names, characters, places, and incidents either are products of the author's creativity or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is unintentional and should not be construed as factual representation.
In this story, power is not shown through violence, wealth, or fear. It is revealed through silence, timing, and the invisible decisions that shape human lives without warning. Raphael Moretti is a man who controls industries, negotiations, and outcomes. Yet for the first time in his life, he enters a situation where control does not belong to him. Language becomes his limitation, understanding becomes his dependency, and a woman he barely knows becomes the only bridge between him and the world he is trying to navigate. But the true moral weight of this story does not come from business or mafia influence. It comes from what happens when human connection is reduced to assumptions, and when silence is mistaken for stability. The woman who waits all night represents trust without confirmation, faith placed in someone who has already made a different choice. And the man who moves on without warning represents a harsh truth about power. Those who lead complex worlds often make irreversible decisions long before others even realize a choice exists. This story teaches a difficult but necessary lesson. Being loyal does not guarantee being chosen. Waiting does not guarantee being valued. And understanding someone deeply does not mean they will reveal their truth to you in return. But it also teaches something more important. Real strength is not about controlling others. It is about recognizing truth quickly, accepting reality without denial, and choosing your own direction even when clarity comes too late. In the world of power, silence is never empty. It is information, it is decision, it is conclusion without announcement. And the greatest wisdom this story offers is simple. Never build your future on words that were never spoken to you directly. Build it on clarity, action, and self-respect. Because in the end, those who survive the game of power are not the strongest. They are the ones who learn to read the silence before it becomes a loss.